Okay, I don't know how to start. I think this is my dilemma because on one hand, I'm a public administration scholar, researcher. I teach, I write, I criticize what government does. But at the same time, I'm also the government. I'm the one in charge of the PPP program. But let me reconcile that in the context of our discussion on what co-creation is all about. There's a lot of definition of what co-creation is if you check the literature, but I think the challenge is to concretize that definition in real terms, at least in our context. Quick definition that I saw, in the public sector at least, it's referred to as co-production. Co-production in the public sector, referring to the interactive process through which providers and users apply their respective resources and capabilities in its production and service delivery. So the keywords, providers, users, and there's no reference to whether that provider is either public or private. And there's no reference as well to whether the resources that they are using in the co-production, co-creation task is public sector or private sector resources. The point is, there's no clear delineation of what the nature and source of these resources and inputs to the process of co-creation, building together, and collaboration. And I think that's where public-private partnership as a real, existing, controversial, difficult, dangerous program we're having is, I think, very relevant. Okay, this one. You know this already. We all teach this in our PPP, PA 101, and I got this slide from my very good professor, Dr. Brillante. Sir, I will not talk about this very heavy slide. I just want you all, public administration professors, scholars, teachers, students, look at the second. We all talk about, when we talk about good governance, we talk about how governance should be done. We always talk about accountability, transparency. Dr. Wu talked about the rule of law or predictability as we refer to it in our literature. Very few of us talk about the very important element called participation. Diba? The participation, the contribution of non-state actors that are heavily involved in the conduct of governing. I remember Ma'am Lady Carino was my teacher in my PA 301. Sabi niya, mayroong isang paragraph na definition ng governance, may isang sentence na definition, but essentially it is beyond the state public administration. Pamamahalang pamadla na hindi lamang nakatuon at hindi lamang ang sangkot ay yung Estado, but other non-state actors. One very important actor is private business. The very premise, the very framework of governance with participation as key element provides the premise for public and private sector interface. Doon natin inihugot ang public-private partnership as many things. Next slide, please. As a development strategy. Nasa ating constitution, the constitution says the Philippine government, the state recognizes the role of private sector as a party in development. We have a law that provided very specific mechanisms of private sector participation, BOT law, joint venture guidelines, the local government code, etc. Private sector as a participant in the conduct of governing can provide, accelerate provision of goods and services. It's a financing strategy. We look at private sector as a financing option, diba? We, in our fiscal management and the resources we look at, government appropriation, GA, very limited, ODA, official development assistance, very tied, and private sector resource, or combinations of them. We bring in private sector because of their efficiency inputs. Important elements of service delivery that we have limited or have constraints on. Design, construction, operation, given our inherent limitations in procurement, engineering, ICT. That is an efficiency input that we get also from private sector. And finally, at least in the Philippines, PPP is a procurement option. It's a different mechanism to enjoin private sector away from the regular and very limited 9184 procurement law. We have mechanisms such as solicited and unsolicited proposals. I will not talk about this. So PPP, at least in the Philippines, ang problema natin, we use the term PPP very loosely. Merong feeding program ang isang congregation ng mga madre at saka LGU, they call it PPP. Very loosely defined mechanism of public-private partnership, but at least the official PPP program we're doing or we're working on refers to contractual agreements formalized by government and by a government entity and a private partner. And this can be, and these are mostly in infrastructure and development projects. A quick summary of that. PPP, and the slide basically tells us PPP is not privatization. It's a common misconception. Because privatization is when you have fully delegated, fully transferred the ownership of the asset, of the facility, and the mandate to deliver the service. In PPPs, you don't do that. The owner of the facility, the mandate to deliver the service is retained with government or the government entity in this case. In our case here in the Philippines, we're looking at modalities such as developer transfer, concession agreements, joint ventures, different modalities or scopes and degrees of public-private partnerships. Ang slide na to, yung kaliwa, government does everything. Yung kanan, that's when you have fully delegated everything or divest. Yun ang privatization. PPP is in the middle. Different, changing, expanding nature and scope of private sector participation. We have a legal framework. Ang problema din in the Philippines, we don't have a PPP law. There's now a priority bill in Congress called PPP Act, both promoted in both houses. In the Senate, ang prime mover nito, I see Senator Pacquiao. In Congress, is Senator Salceda, Congressman Salceda. We're looking at different legal frameworks from where we define or we draw our mandate, capacity, processes, requirements to engage private sector. Again, very important, and we learned this from our PA 241 class, no? Aside from policy, what we'll look at the institutional framework. In the Philippines, aside from policy being the enabler of what we can and cannot do, importante yung institution was mandated to do just that. So we always look at the policy and institutional framework. In case of PPPs, not all public agencies can do PPPs in this country. Some are inherently mandated to be contracting entities. Others are oversight, regulatory, review, approvals, etc. There are recent policy amendments to the PPP framework, and these are specific areas of policy instruments that we have been doing all this time based on our lessons. For example, we now have a new policy on termination payments, assessing value for money, managing affected employees, public consultation, very much public ad and governance inputs to the way we do PPPs. And these are changing, these are evolving. Like a few months ago, we issued a policy circular, PPP policy circular on safeguards, mainstreaming gender, social, and environmental considerations into PPPs. Okay, what can be done as PPPs in this country is very broad. We refer to them as infrastructure and development projects. So not just your hard infrastructure, but even soft infrastructure. And you know very well we're doing that in various locations, ICT systems, slaughterhouses, public school buildings. Some are not very good, some have real issues, but point is, these are provided for as eligible sectors or projects that can be done as PPP. Solicited and unsolicited, I mentioned this already. I will not talk about the process anymore. This is lengthy, but something worthwhile for us as well to understand. Solicited and unsolicited track. As I said, it's very much part of our development program. Our long-term plan, ambisyon natin, has PPP as infrastructure development as a major input. The 10-point agenda of this current administration says we are planning to accelerate infrastructure spending with PPPs accounting for a huge chunk of that target of 7% of the GDP by 2022. You know, you heard of build. Government looking at different mechanisms or resources to fund our long overdue infrastructure requirements, from appropriations, from our ODA, and of course, around 30% of that would be through private sector finance through PPP. Two days ago, the administration also announced that we're expanding the build into 100+ projects. Nasa dyaryo ito ng mga ilang araw, basically including more private sector, more PPPs into the long list of projects. Realizing, of course, that there's a limitation we can do in the previous list, and private sector can really contribute a lot. Again, it's a long debate that we can talk about that, but the point is there's recognition of private sector's input being incorporated into the formal programs and prioritization of projects. These are also available materials, literature, and I'd like you, our public administration scholars, teachers, students, to look at this, consider this. There's a really good written materials you can use in your classes, in your researches, all available in our website. We even put together a PPP, model PPP contract along with the UP College of Law. Quick snapshot where we are. We're looking at the huge pipeline of projects in various stages, both national and local projects here. It's happening all over the country. A lot of challenge as to why and how problematic it may be, but the point is there's increasing recognition of how private sector can be harnessed in government's co-production, co-creation of very important public goods and services that it cannot provide on its own. Last 3 slides, just a quick snapshot. Where we are in the rest of the region in terms of our PPP initiative, we're not kulelat compared to our neighbors in the region. We're in fact most PPP ready compared to our neighbors in the region. These are real studies or assessment, comparative reviews of our framework, projects, the kind of deals we've been doing, how it's monitored. It's not perfect, a lot of areas to be improved on. But compared to our neighbors, some of them are just starting. We are, as they call most, PPP ready. What's next, therefore? We are, of course, going to continue the PPP program. It's part of this agenda, and I suppose it will expand or extend beyond the term of the next regime. PPP, by the way, is not new. It's not just a Pinoy Dilawan initiative. It's a product of a long private sector engagement from Cory Aquino's divestment privatization type of inputs to Ramos's build up or transfer to Erap Estrada's PSP and flagship projects to Gloria Macapagal Arroyo's BOTs, Pinoy's PPPs, and now build of the current administration. All different branding, renaming, reframing, but all capitalizing on the role of the private sector as financing, as efficiency input, and as a development program. And this is where I think this should be relevant to all of us. And I think this is where the challenges, as far as PPP is concerned, and the way forward for us, PAGHAIs. What are the challenges that we all have, we can draw from this narrative of PPP in this country as a co-creation, co-production mechanism? Number one, there's a need to review, refine, strengthen the PPP policy, regulatory, and institutional framework, particularly defining the appropriate nature, scope, extent of private sector participation. Not all projects should be done as PPP. There are projects that can best be done by government. Not all projects should be provided government support and subsidy. Not all projects can best be delivered by private sector. There are limitations. Policy and regulatory frameworks in terms of rules of entry and exit. How do we pre-qualify them? How do we terminate them? On what basis? How do we manage their compliance? And how do we exact accountability from them? Standards and specifications, service delivery levels, compliance and tracking, and of course, rationalizing public sector risks and exposure. But aside from policy being refined and strengthened, what about the institutions? Are they capable, ready, and enabled to actually develop something out of that? Reconciling the policy making, regulatory oversight, contracting and implementation mandates. Marami tayong ahensya na inherent yung conflict na yun. Siya ang contracting entity, siya pa regulatory body, siya din ang monitoring entity, all within himself. So there's that confusion, there's that inherent challenge of you bounding to fail to begin with. Enabling emerging sectors. There's a lot of areas, sectors where private sector co-creation, co-production, partnership is happening. Local governments, I think that's now 8 joint venture projects in in several water districts all over the country. Several PPPs, local initiatives, local contractors, some problematic, some in local governments, GOCCs. Some SCUs are doing PPPs. Where there's now a study being done for a PGH facility within UP Diliman. There's a hospital project done West Visayas State University to be done as PPP. Sila Bulacan State University received an unsolicited PPP proposal. Others, faculty housing, etc. Is it possible? Is it allowed in the law? Yes. But are they ready? Do we have the capacity? Are we clear about what we are getting into? And finally, concretizing the accountability and transparency mechanisms. How do we say this is done well, this is transparent, there's accountability? These are more intangible abstracts that we talk and write about, but we are unable to pin down into specific items when we talk about specific projects that we see and feel and experience. Finally, this is where we come in. All of these issues I mentioned are the very things we are doing. Diba? Public administration and governance, HAIs, getting involved in the pursuit of said reforms, because these are the very things we talk about, that we research about, that we talk with our students. Public policy, fiscal administration, institutional studies, development planning, public enterprise, etc., etc. There's all of these fields in the various aspects of PPP. Policy review, fiscal management and administration, institutional readiness and studies, planning, public enterprise. The challenge is, most of these are just topics that we have dun sa ating curriculum as a mandatory item, not specific to a field. I've seen some curricular programs, PPP normally is tackled as a special problem topic under public enterprise. Okay, a special problem sa dulo, but it really is bigger than that. It has policy, fiscal management, organizational studies component that you can expand and develop in understanding public-private partnership and even this whole idea of co-creation and co-production. This can be in the form of policy studies, recommendation. There's a PPP Act happening right now. The local government code is being amended, and there's a section on public-private partnership. I was asked to participate and provide inputs. The Universal Health Law was recently enacted, the drafting the IRR. They asked me to provide inputs to the part of the IRR on the role of private sector in public health. Point is, where are the HEIs participating, contributing to this real policy program initiatives where we can actually contribute to our research and instruction and capacity to bring in our academic expertise? I think that's the challenge. Of course, case studies of successes and failures, how we can replicate them, etc., etc. Dean Alex is always saying, maglalanding dapat tayo. How do we get out or go down from this very beautiful narrative of what should be, what can be, what should we do in this whole governance narrative into real, concrete, on-the-ground problems? One of the problem on the ground are these PPPs that we're doing. How can we bring down into these PPPs this whole idea of transparency, accountability, improvement, integrity, etc., is the challenge. And HEIs in public administration and governance, I think, are at the forefront of all of that. And that's when we can truly bond together, bridge, collaborate, and do a real bayanihan. Maraming salamat. Good afternoon.